About to go live.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I'd like to welcome you to this special event on maritime security issues in that crucible of the world's future, the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for being with us. Before handing off to my inestimable colleague, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who will moderate today's discussion, I wanted to announce with great pleasure that this event kicks off the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative, a project that will be led by Jonathan and the rest of the team here at MLI. The initiative will focus on a range of critical areas in the Indo-Pacific, from security to trade to governance. This region is of crucial importance to Canada and must not be overlooked. Today's discussion will focus on just one element of these stakes. The Indo-Pacific is facing a host of shared security challenges, from maritime piracy and crime to heated territorial disputes. To shed light on these issues, we're pleased, once again, to bring together some of the leading thinkers from Canada and the world to discuss the key maritime challenges in the Indo-Pacific and how Canada can and should become an indispensable partner alongside like-minded allies in ensuring a free and open Pacific Ocean in our interests and those of all humanity. We do these events with you in mind. So I thank you again for your interest in MLI's work, and now pass the baton to Jonathan Berkshire Miller, the host of today's event. Over to you, Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan, you're muted if you wouldn't mind. Just starting that again, sorry.
Sorry, this year is the year of the mute button, so I'm guilty of it this year. Thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction. Good morning, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I am Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, based here in Ottawa. It is my great pleasure today to be your moderator for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and very timely discussion on the shared maritime security challenges in this region. We are really lucky to have speakers today coming to us live from Tokyo, Washington, D.C., Paris, and Nova Scotia, which is very close to my heart as a maritimer. First of all, I'd like to thank all of our supporters, audience members, and others today for joining this discussion. As Brian noted, today is important not only because we are talking about these crucial maritime security issues, but also because today is the launch of MLI's Canada and the Indo-Pacific Initiative, which will commit a great deal of our efforts and resources in the coming months to looking at this pivotal region and how it intersects with Canada. We hope you continue to join our future events on the Indo-Pacific and read our future essays and policy briefs on Canada's strategic imperative to understand and organize its engagement in this region. Rather than marginalize the geopolitical risks in the region, the COVID-19 pandemic has conversely heightened geostrategic competition with a rise in tensions, which is perhaps most acute in the Indo-Pacific. Some examples include renewed tensions in the East and South China Seas, skirmishes on the India-China line of actual control, an uptick of provocations and rhetoric from North Korea, bolder Chinese activities in the Taiwan Straits, and a rapidly evolving situation in Hong Kong. All of these geopolitical shifts are happening within the broader strategic lens of a hardening of competition between the United States and China. These concerns in the maritime realm are also not limited to the East and South China Seas. In the Indian Ocean, there has been a buildup of Chinese infrastructure development in critical areas, such as deep ports in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. These moves have acutely informed the decision-making of policymakers in India, who are aware of China's long-term geopolitical motivations in Delhi's periphery. Similarly, in the Pacific Ocean, there is also concern that encroachment and strategic competition is jeopardizing the future of sovereignty of many small island nations. Finally, it is important to note that these maritime challenges are not limited only to issues of territory and military competition, but also encompass critical issues such as environmental security, maritime piracy, and the sustainability of fish stocks in the surrounding seas. Simply put, this is a multifaceted series of challenges with no simple solution. So with that said, let me briefly introduce today's participants. First of all, we have Professor Ken Jimbo, who I'm introducing him first, and he'll go first because he's calling from the latest time zone. He's near midnight. Professor Ken Jimbo is a professor at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University, and he also holds a number of other titles, including a senior research fellow at the Cannon Institute of Global Studies and the Tokyo Foundation. After Ken, we're going to have Greg Poling from Washington, D.C. And for those of you who were able to attend our event last year in Ottawa before the pandemic, Greg was able to be there in Ottawa, and I made a joke, and it's a joke, but it's real. If you do a Google image search of Greg and the South China Sea, you'll see his face come every time. So he's an expert on the South China Sea. He's a senior fellow for Southeast Asia and director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. And I believe that Greg has just completed or is finishing his book on the South China Sea. So maybe at some point, Greg, you can tell us about that. After Greg, we have Eva Pesova, who is a senior Japan fellow at the Vrije University in Brussels. Also, she's an associate fellow at the FRS in France, and a senior advisor of the Asia-Pacific Research and Advice Network. And Eva is an expert on maritime security issues and formerly worked with the European External Action Service. And last, but definitely not least, we have Eric Leary, who served in the Royal Canadian Navy for 36 years, with his last post as commander of the Canadian Fleet Pacific. In that role, he was the Coalition Task Group Commander for the South. He also held a role, where he was the Coalition Task Group Commander for the Southern Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz sector during the War on Terror. After retiring from the Royal Canadian Navy, Commander Leary has also received his PhD from Dalhousie and now is an independent scholar and has many good policy briefs, some of them at MLI. So we have a great cast here from all over the world to talk on these issues. Let's get started with Ken, if you don't mind, because you're the farthest away. So Ken, I'll give it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for your kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to join this webinar. And a warm congratulations, Jonathan, for launching the MLI Indo-Pacific initiative. I would like to make 3 points regarding Indo-Pacific. First, the Indo-Pacific remains to be the leading foreign policy concept, despite having a major leadership transitions, both in Tokyo and Washington, D.C. And for Tokyo, the concept has been reaffirmed in numerous occasions, as the words of Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, and through the numbers of the meetings with the foreign leaders. For Washington, D.C., there seems to be certain degrees of hesitation among the Biden transition team whether to carry over the concept from the previous administration. But many of U.S. commitments so far, and also through the Congress initiatives and renaming of, for example, PACOM to the Indo-PACOM, already implemented under the Indo-Pacific concept. And it has also become the dominant regional policy platform for major European states, including UK, France, and Germany, and also for ASEAN. So that the concept has created so-called diplomatic gravity that many players will plug and play on this platform. And I believe that the gravity remains to be strong. That's my first point. And the second, something we should also emphasize is that different priorities and approaches do exist in Indo-Pacific concept. And I always argue that the Indo-Pacific concept would only be successful if everybody in the town claims the copyright of this concept, which means that there should be no one-fits-all type of understanding for the Indo-Pacific. For example, for the case of Tokyo, there are certain degrees of mixture of so-called competitive approaches to this concept, and also the cooperative side of the approaches by utilizing this Indo-Pacific. And for the case of emphasizing the role of the U.S. forward presence and emphasizing freedom navigation and overflights, advancing so-called Quad security cooperation, and that also extends to the economic domain, for example, the regional investment for the quality infrastructure and the promoting the Blue Dot network or the China free clean digital network are all regarded to be pursuing the competitive approach under the Indo-Pacific. However, there are numerous elements of the non-zero-sum side of the cooperative approaches involved in this concept. So that includes exploring interface between Indo-Pacific and the China-led Belt and Road Initiative through, for example, co-financing in infrastructure projects and also bilateral schemes to be found like in Japan-China cooperation in the third market. And also, recently we found the significance of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that also be found by having the Japan, China, Korea, first time in the history joining in the FTA network together. So by knowing such cooperative approaches, Beijing was able to take more nuanced approach, especially in contrast with what the Moscow is approaching to this Indo-Pacific. And then they are not fully accepting the concept, but neither totally deny it. And I think this is a very important interface by how to recast the strategy in this wider regional framework. And finally, with a quick notes that I also like to mention that impact of the COVID-19. And I would say that despite the spread of COVID-19, the security challenge in the Indo-Pacific have been constantly updated. With having, as Jonathan mentioned, that having a Chinese, sort of modus operandi, maritime activities, both in East and South China Sea and beyond. And correspondingly, we resumed joint training and exercises among U.S. and partners, especially the latter half of this year, by having biannual Operation Keen Sword, joint exercises between Japan and the United States off the coast of Okinawa, and also iconic Quad Malabar naval exercise in the Bay of Bengal, and also so-called the Pacific Vanguard exercise in Guam by US, Japan, Australia, and Korea. And so I think those kind of defense cooperation network has been quite viable despite the COVID-19 spread. So I would like to end my remark by saying that the pandemic has accelerated the change of the geopolitics that has already begun before the pandemic broke out. And I believe that it continues to be the trend for 2021 in the role of the Indo-Pacific. I'll stop here and looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much, Ken. That's really helpful comments, and so much to kind of tease out there. I really liked your point that when looking at the Indo-Pacific, we don't need to have this one box fits all. The Indo-Pacific concept can, and I think has shown in recent months that there are many ways to kind of for states to fit into this concept, and they all don't necessarily need to follow to the T the U.S. approach or the Japanese approach, rather, but they can take parts of that. So that's a really interesting point. Okay, can I move next to Greg Poling, please, Greg?
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to talk, pick up where Ken left off and talk a bit about how things have shifted over the last 9 to 12 months amid COVID on the maritime space, and then look forward a bit to the incoming U.S. administration. So, as Ken noted, we, despite I think a lot of high hopes in the spring, one thing we definitely have not seen from COVID is any decrease in maritime tensions or decrease in operational tempo by any side, but particularly on China's side. So my initiative, AMTI, just published a report last week on China Coast Guard patrols. Not only did they not decrease in the South China Sea, they've actually increased the number of ship days spent patrolling reefs off the coast of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. We expect to publish a report in the next week or two, well, hopefully next week before the holidays get us, on naval operational tempo. That'll show much the same, that there's certainly been no decrease in the number of naval exercises and naval transits conducted by either China or the United States. On the U.S. side, it seems that there was a real effort after the Roosevelt aircraft carrier was stricken with COVID to then step up operations in the region to show that the U.S. Navy's readiness hadn't been affected. And so that line's probably flat. China's might have moderately increased this year. What has certainly changed, though, is the messaging. So even if the operational tempo from China is either flat or modestly increasing, the bombastic nature of the way that this has been discussed by Chinese officials has ratcheted up radically. So one of the effects of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, and I know that people are tired of hearing that language, but one of the effects is clear that when incidents have cropped up over the last 9 months, the oil and gas disputes with Malaysia, both in the spring and the fall, the two different boat rammings vis-a-vis Vietnam, targeting of the Filipinos with fire control radar in the spring, right? All of this happens, and rather than seek to de-escalate, as would have been normal, as for instance China did when there was a fishing standoff with Indonesia at the very beginning of the year, Chinese diplomats, even those in the embassies in those countries, have basically gone in front of the camera and said, tough, these are our waters and we'll do what we want. It's a level of rhetoric that we really haven't seen since the kind of highest days of tension shortly after the Filipinos filed their arbitration case back in 2013, 2014. And it certainly clashes with the tone that Beijing has taken since 2016, where for the last 3 to 4 years, there was an effort to quietly tamp down tensions diplomatically, even while pursuing more operational presence on the water. I think that that's going to continue. We don't see any evidence that Beijing is shifting toward a more, diplomatic, soft approach toward its neighbors. And at the same time, we've seen pretty sharp shifts among other Indo-Pacific players that I think will continue to play out. So Australia is the obvious case. Right now, the discussion about China in Australia has radically shifted. For the last several years, it was often the case that Americans would say, well, the Australians are about 2 years behind us on the China threat. And whether it's the South China Sea or the East China Sea or trade issues, that's no longer the case. I think it's now pretty clear that the bulk of discussion within Australia is now right where or ahead of where the US is vis-a-vis China. China has also continued to increase presence around the Senkakus in the East China Sea. The overall number of patrols hasn't changed, but the length of stay of these Chinese vessels has increased. They've hit new records almost every month this year. And so that has helped lead to a breakdown with Tokyo. Obviously, the COVID-19 caused Xi's visit to Tokyo to be canceled. But even without that, tensions have clearly increased, and I expect that to continue. We've seen, as we're going to hear in a moment, a number of European parties weigh in more explicitly on these questions, including the South China Sea, in ways that we haven't seen since at least early 2016. And so I think there is a sense that on both China and the kind of the Indo-Pacific partner side, and that's not even mentioning India, of course, which after Ladakh is clearly ahead of the rest of us on its sense of the China threat, that everybody is poised to increase, not decrease, maritime tensions. And so that leads to what do we expect from the US side? Well, there's been a bit of heartburn in Asia, but mainly from just a small number of Asian countries, Vietnam, India, some quarters in Japan, that the Biden team might be too soft on China. But the vast majority of the region, when you look at the public opinion polling, seems to feel pretty good. Most of them reported, both public and elite polling, that they preferred a Biden administration to a second Trump administration. They've gotten what they wanted. Now the Biden team will have to deliver. But the reason that they preferred that is because I think most in Asia recognize that the entire U.S. conversation has shifted. So there is no world in which Biden can be soft on China, right? This will not look like the incoming Obama team in 2009. There are no doves, China doves left in the Democratic caucus in the United States. Most of them had already shifted over the last few years based on the trade issues, the high-tech issues, South China Sea and Xinjiang. I think Hong Kong was the final nail in the coffin. Any Democrat who might have still been holding out hope for a return to more calm bilateral tensions. That went away with the national security law in the spring. And so Biden comes in a different world than Obama did, and a different world than Trump did. He also comes in with a cabinet that's lining up to be the most qualified and most familiar with Asia that we've had in decades, at least. And so I think they will be much more likely to hit the ground running with things like the U.S.-Japan alliance, getting the U.S.-Philippine alliance back on track, recognizing that the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the rising tensions on cross-strait relations, that those are immediate challenges. And finally, I think the reason that the Biden administration likely has more credibility on some of these issues is that the first thing they're going to do on day one is issue an executive order rejoining Paris, re-engaging with the WHO, and joining the COVAX alliance. Those two things, re-engagement with climate change and re-engagement with global health policy, are going to give them considerably more credibility than the current team. And when a Biden team goes out to Asia and talks about international law and freedom of the seas, I think that they're going to have a lot more credibility than the Trump team, right? When Mike Pompeo comes in and says, hey, let's talk about freedom of the seas, everybody goes, okay, we get that you don't like China, but come on, you're gonna talk to us about international law. So I don't, there's no guarantee that things are going to be more rational or more strategic or improve, but I would say that this incoming team has a much better shot at it than the departing one. And I'll wrap up there.
Well, thanks so much, Greg. Again, a lot to tease out of that. I would agree with you. I mean, a couple different interesting points that you made. One on U.S.-China strategic competition. I would agree that it's structural in its nature. I think you referenced the bipartisan consensus on this, and this is something that if people think this is going to go away in 2 months, I think that they're mistaken. Another important point that I think you alluded to, which I hear from some of my friends in Asia as well, is that the subsecretary sort of positions, which many of them haven't been filled in the U.S. during the Trump administration. Sometimes it's like having that friend where he's not picking up the phone because he's not there. That really matters. I mean, it seems sort of boring and in the weeds, but I think the way that diplomacy works often is at that subsecretary level, and not having those positions really, I think, was a detriment. So hopefully those positions can get filled under a new U.S. administration. And also, I mean, maybe something we can kind of look at question time is the future of, at least from a branding perspective, the free and open Indo-Pacific from the U.S. I think there's a lot of sort of speculation on that too. Secure and prosper seems to be the new moniker used often. I mean, whether that qualitatively means anything differently, probably not, but maybe it's a new acronym for us to learn. But very interesting remarks. And I think it's a good segue to Eva, because I think one of your really important points was that while these challenges are definitely there in the U.S.-China relationship and it's impacted the U.S. approach to the Indo-Pacific, by no means is that unique. And I think that's a really crucial point. I think from our perch here sitting in Canada, we see that quite clearly. Obviously, we're watching U.S.-China competition, but we have our own unique challenges with China. Australia has its own unique challenges with China. And I'm sure Eva will let us know soon that many countries in Europe are facing the same balancing act. So Eva, over to you, please.
Thanks, Jonathan, and congratulations also from me on your new position. I'm delighted that Canada is getting so active in the Indo-Pacific debate, and that's something that really it has in common with Europe and some of the other partners that were a little bit late in joining the debate or starting the reflection. And in that sense, as you said, I would follow up rather naturally on what Greg said, because Europe is one of those late awakers to the China challenge, although it has been a trend that lasts now since 2016, roughly. But we are kind of on the verge of formulating our own Indo-Pacific strategy. But for the longest time, of course, Europe has been reluctant to join it for the same reason. I think that Canada and other kind of middle actors, I call them stuck in the middle actors, not necessarily middle powers, for the fear of being kind of drawn into one or the other camp, between the US and China, rather having obvious interests, economic interests with China. Now, even if the Europeans have been kind of not very vocal on the Indo-Pacific, that doesn't mean that they haven't been concerned. Of course, as the world's largest trading bloc, the maritime security especially in the region, and the need to maintain free, safe, and secure maritime environment has been a top priority for the EU's foreign policy. And in fact, maritime security has been the key pillar in engaging with some of the Asian partners, whether it was Japan, Korea, ASEAN, India, and Australia, of course, US on the other hand. Maritime security is also an area where Europeans have been most involved. Now, I thought Greg and Ken will be talking extensively about the South China Sea and the East China Sea disputes, which are some of the most visible security hotspots. And even there, Greg mentioned, yes, we tried as much as we could eventually to be present with the French routine exercises since 2016, with, of course, also a symbolic political presence of other European member states, with the UK naval presence starting in 2018, and with other kind of support at the European level, albeit not through gunboats or naval presence, but let's say by the deposition of note verbale at the UN Security Council by the UK, Germany, and France in September. I mean, this is the sort of different levels where the EU can join. But besides the more traditional security hotspots, South China Sea, East China Sea, it seems that it's never enough repeated. It really is not the only security issues in the region. When it comes to maritime security, we mentioned piracy, we mentioned crime, climate change, environmental issues, all sorts of practical functional security issues that really needs to be addressed. And that is that sort of front that EU has been working extensively for the last couple of years in promoting maritime domain awareness, in promoting, let's say, rules-based solution, in promoting environmental solutions, maritime multilateralism with ASEAN, maritime connectivity. There's a separate faction in the connectivity strategy looking at maritime security, promoting port security, port safety, etc., etc. So these are not obviously less visible, but not irrelevant issues that really needs to be addressed in the Indo-Pacific, and that seem to be completely overweight and kind of ignored in the mounting US-China rivalry, and in the focus, extreme focus on hard security issues. Now, although there is no Indo-Pacific strategy for now, as we speak, there is one in the making. You know that different member states have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and the key issues that I mentioned, maritime multilateralism, promotion of international law, connectivity, maritime domain awareness, are issues that are repeated in all security strategies or Indo-Pacific strategies that currently exist. France has been the first one. Of course, France is a resident Indo-Pacific power. It has maritime territories. It is the largest EEZ in the region. It has a naval presence and has a strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, since 2017. A big surprise was the decision by Germany to publish its Indo-Pacific policy guidelines at the beginning of September. And that really started this kind of renewed interest at the EU level to eventually come up with an EU guidelines, followed by the Netherlands in November, just a month ago. I think now we have a non-paper that is currently circulated at the COASI group, which is the consultancy, the group of member states at the European Council in charge of Asia-Pacific affairs. So we are likely to see a document, whether it's called strategy, vision, or guidelines, probably at the beginning of 2021. We can speculate about the content. I'm glad that everyone mentioned before me that Indo-Pacific is a flexible concept that suits actually the European interests very well. We can assume that the core principles of maritime, when it comes to maritime security at least, maritime multilateralism, transparent connectivity or maritime connectivity, and of course, freedom of navigation and rules-based solutions will be at the core. And that is probably, hopefully, something that we will be able to work on with other partners, including Canada and those who have been reluctant for the longest time to actually join the debate for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning.
Thank you so much, Eva. I think it's really helpful remarks, and I think it underscores the point that Ken made at the beginning, that that Indo-Pacific concepts need not be kind of uniform, but they can suit different partners. And I know the Canadians very much will be interested to see as more European states kind of develop their concepts. I remember, I think it was a couple years back now. Time seems to have flown so quickly since the pandemic started. But when I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue and I came back with one of the glossy pamphlets that the French Defense Ministry has on their Indo-Pacific approach. And I remember the sort of the jaws dropping in Canada and from some of the bureaucracy folks who looked at it. And it takes me to an important point, and I think that perhaps some states in Europe have kind of done a better job at this, is the public diplomacy side of the Indo-Pacific. So of course, the nuts and bolts of what you're actually going to do is very, very important, and it has to align with your interests. But I think the branding and public diplomacy is really important to signal to states in that region that this is a theater of great importance. So I think perhaps that's something, again, the Canadian side can learn from different member countries in Europe. With that, I'm going to pass next to Commodore Laurier for a very important perspective from Canada. And Commodore Laurier has spent so much time in the Canadian Navy, so I'm sure he has some great insights on this. So Commodore Laurier.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all for some great presentations. I'm going to focus on the areas of greatest security concern to Canada and those where we are directly involved. They occasionally are not the same. North Korea. Despite UN sanctions, the North Korean regime continues to develop and test long-range missiles and enrich uranium for its nuclear weapons programs. China, regrettably, is assisting North Korea via surreptitious efforts to export its products. Canada continues to support the sanction enforcement effort by regularly sending a frigate and a maritime patrol aircraft, and all of this is well coordinated via the 7th Fleet staffs. While this effort has not stopped weapons development, it has provided the necessary function of demonstrating that rule breaking will bring consequences. It also illustrates the value of a multinational approach, especially for Canada. Hong Kong. China has broken its 1997 agreement to provide a one country, two systems approach to Hong Kong. Canada, in company with its Five Eyes allies, has condemned this move, cancelled its extradition treaty with Hong Kong, and begun an export ban on sensitive goods to it. We also appear to have particularly upset China after Parliament considered extending asylum to Hong Kong's democracy protesters. This led the Chinese ambassador in Canada to suggest such action could affect the safety of Canada's 300,000 citizens in the territory. When questioned by the media, he did not deny that this was a threat. If conditions seriously deteriorate in Hong Kong, it will present a non-combatant extraction operation of potentially immense difficulty, as China is very likely to interfere. This will cause for a major maritime multinational response, and there is no framework for this now. Taiwan. China continues to threaten Taiwan with almost daily aircraft probing its defenses. It has also in China created an exact replica of downtown Taipei to assist Chinese airborne forces in practicing a potential air assault. This is outrageous. Aside from supporting Taiwanese attendance at the World Health Organization, Canada has been silent. However, this year also brought the unedifying spectacle of the foreign minister refusing to say the word, quote, Taiwan, unquote, at a news conference, despite media probing for him to do so. Taiwan needs more direct diplomatic and practical support. In that light, one must commend the US and France for assisting it with defense sales, despite probably high Chinese pressure. Noting Canadian naval firms have considered doing so, but many are daunted by the challenge of getting government export approval. South China Sea. In the past earlier, Canada did not speak out over China's 9-dash line, claiming maritime rights over 80% of the South China Sea. I think many expected China to eventually reveal a legal basis for this. China did not, and the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration exposed the complete lack of any legal basis for that claim. With regard to the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Sea, their report concluded, quote, "The tribunal considers China's violation of its obligations to be manifest," period. While Canada supported the PCA decision, the tribunal decision, it only called for, quote, "all states," unquote, to comply and did not even mention China. The tribunal's report, as we have heard from Greg, did not significantly affect Chinese actions in the South China Sea recently. While it's no longer building islands, the fortifications remain and are frequently used by the Chinese Coast Guard as support bases on their way to challenging other states in their own legal economic exclusive zone. Greg mentioned harassing Vietnamese, Malaysian, and Philippine oil and research activities, while they've also been terrorizing other people's fishing fleets, according to the Singapore's RSIS. This year, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel escorted Chinese fishing fleets as they penetrated Indonesia's economic exclusive zone, and this was quickly rebuffed by the Indonesian armed forces. Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam took the obvious lesson from this success and are rearming. And so does Indonesia, now seeking additional 48 fighters, 3 corvettes, and 4 submarines from France. The United States and Japan have assisted this effort, and the U.S. has recently made it crystal clear its mutual defense treaties with the Philippines and Japan will extend to their offshore islands and deployed naval forces. The U.S. has also led freedom of navigation efforts there, and this has been recently joined by Australia, Japan, UK, France, and Canada. These latter states perform a sort of freedom of navigation light, with Canada preferring the term presence patrols. We learned recently that the Canadian government has directed that these patrols be kept low profile as possible. Nevertheless, the U.S. Navy credits all those states, including Canada, for their critical support in the freedom of navigation effort. These patrols, in whatever form, signal very direct support for the rules-based international order. The setting up of a potential multilateral U.S. fleet in the area has great potential to reinforce this. In other areas, Canada has also been meeting security threats from China. Foremost here is the hostage diplomacy waged by China in response to Canada's holding Madame Meng, Chief Financial Officer of Huawei, for possible extradition to the U.S. In addition to the arrest of Michael Korbig and Spavar on dubious grounds, China has imposed a boycott of Canadian goods. There has been no Canadian response to this, other than a quiet and at times not very successful reaching out to allies for support. The government is increasingly critiqued for its timidity. One recent news report called it groveling, and a recent poll showed 75% of Canadians expect a firmer response to China. Government inaction may also be showing that hostage diplomacy works. At the same time, and in a probably related manner, China has been subject to Chinese influence operations via the successful purchase of all Canadian Chinese media, their intimidation of Chinese immigrants, and it is increasingly being alleged a program of elite capture of Canadian officials via life-changing financial payments. Both factors are likely the cause of this country's timid, unofficial China policy. The foreign minister promised a reset in January, and nothing occurred, even though the foreign policy bureaucracy provided them with a template this spring that would move away from comprehensive engagement. The major Canadian parliamentary opposition parties have used their majority to force a needed new China policy by next week. I'm not confident it will occur. All of this suggests that, and there's no surprise here, that Canada appears to be only ready to take action against China within a multilateral construct. I suspect the main effort will remain within the Five Eyes community, plus Germany and France, and not within the evolving Quad, but we'll leave that question for the discussion. We are also watching the role of the Biden administration's Summit of Democracies in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a really helpful, a great scan of some of the different issues that we face in the region, and some that we didn't quite highlight as much. I think one thing that was really important that you noted that was the efforts of the Canadian Navy. In particular, I think you referenced Operation Neon and around the Korean Peninsula, Five Eyes Plus operation to ensure that North Korea is not able to circumvent sanctions. I think you also referenced Taiwan, Hong Kong. So it's a really comprehensive scan. And I think it highlights to my mind that it is important to note some of the positive things that Canada has been doing in this region. And I think most of those, frankly, are from the defense naval side. You highlighted a number of them. There's been a range of different port visits, whether it be to Japan and Southeast Asia, the Chikudumi-class submarine deployment. In addition to some of the nuts and bolts agreements, Canada has concluded an AXA, or a cross-servicing acquisition arrangement with Japan, and I think is on the way to developing a GSAMIA, or a military information sharing agreement. So there are some really important developments that have been happening on the defense and naval side. I think the next challenge and the next step will be to formulate this into a broader strategy, which includes the diplomatic front as well. So very impactful and important comments. So that leads us to now to a bit of moderated discussion, and I'm going to sort of abuse the position of the moderator to cheat and get a few questions in before the audience does. So the audience, there's a lot of interest in this topic, so the audience has had a number of different questions that we'll make sure we get to as much as possible. But I did want to start. And this is an area that Greg touched on. So Greg, maybe you can just very briefly touch on it because you already did reference it in your remarks. But I'd like to hear the thoughts of the other three. And this is in particular to the new upcoming U.S. administration. As Greg touched on, he doesn't feel like there's going to be much structural change necessarily with a new Biden administration. Do you, from the European perspective, I know Ken in Japan, people are focused on this quite a bit. Do you see there being any real effective change to the U.S. Indo-Pacific approach? And then how are your different regions kind of looking to respond to this with a new Biden administration? Or is this sort of something that you feel it's steady as she goes, and you're not overly concerned or thinking that there's going to be any big qualitative change? So maybe I'll start with Ken, if that's okay, and then I'll proceed to the next one.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And as I briefly touched upon in my initial remark, that I think the Indo-Pacific concept has its own gravity. And I think one of the initiators to create the gravity was obviously the Trump administration, who incorporated this concept into the national security strategy and following up of any kinds of security and economic engagement under the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. But I think that in terms of applying into the strategic competition with China and also the alliance and the partnership approaches, I guess that there has been some more like alternative paths to be pursued by the Biden administration in terms of overcoming the comprehensive non-zero-sum relationship with China. There will be a pursuant of seeking a cooperation with China on the global issues like climate change, and also cooperation on the international organization that Greg briefly also touched upon. And so that, the comprehensively applying to the free and open aspect on the Indo-Pacific concept will be somewhat reviewed. And also in the case of alliance and partnership approaches, and I think that many of those political psyche of the U.S. to deal with the alliance has been pretty much personalized with the President Trump preferences to how to have the bilateral deal, even among those alliance relationship. And I believe that there will be a more like a systematic bureaucratic approaches will follow by the professionalisms and also the prior to the Trump administration, there has been an approach called the pivot and rebalancing in Asia. And that is not only to rebalance the US commitment in Asia, but also emphasizing the internal dynamics among those allies and partnership. And those could be probably systematically generated under the Biden's approach.
Streaming is on.
Well, thanks so much, Ken. That's very helpful comments, and I think really sums up all similar things that I feel about how this new administration might look. And I think, I mean, if you think even about the moniker "Make America Great Again" or MAGA, I think maybe we can change that to "Make Alliances Great Again." I agree. It's going to be a alliance first sort of focus. I think you've seen that even with the new picks that the Biden administration has made for Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, et cetera. So I think that's going to be a focus. Eva, what's your kind of thoughts on the new administration coming into Washington and how it may intersect with Indo-Pacific issues, maritime issues? Do you see any reason to think that there might be any change?
Well, for the transatlantic relations, it's definitely good news because simply it was difficult to get any worse than it was, to be very honest. And we can assume that under the kind of preference, or we can assume that the Biden administration will return or shift the priority also to Europe and kind of hold it in a different esteem. For the Indo-Pacific more broadly, I think the return to multilateralism is a very good news for the region, simply in a change of a method. We don't expect that the core basic of the policy is going to change dramatically, but the means are probably going to change. And you can see with the announcements that support Southeast Asian countries, for instance, also in dealing with China, I think that's very good news. And the emphasis on working with allies and partners is something that will probably steer the dynamic in the Indo-Pacific in a different direction. Because it is not just the United States being back, but it is United States being back in a different world than 4 years ago, because a lot of those partners and allies have already made their way. We can see how the relationship has changed with Japan, for instance. Japan has kind of, I wouldn't say emancipated itself, but really has taken an upper hand in the relationship. There's been a lot of progress on the European side, on the Australian side. So a lot of those traditional allies and partners have matured in a way and taken a more autonomous or different approach to regional security. So I think now New America being back also needs to deal with a slightly different partnership environment in the region. And overall, I think it can bring a slightly better or more positive light into the security environment. It's also much easier for many of these countries to work with the Biden administration than it was with the previous ones. It's let's say a different choice. It's not really a choice between two evils, but it seems like a lesser evil somehow, and a more open-minded evil.
Thanks, Eva. Yeah, that's a really important point, I think, about the U.S. being back, but things have changed in 4 years. Structurally, I think a lot of the alliances and partnerships remain solid and intact, but I think there have been significant developments. And I think in particular on the broader strategic light, and I think of trade agreements, whether it's the new RCEP that's been signed, obviously TPP, the region has moved in some different directions. And I think the U.S. will have to kind of find ways to kind of work back with some of its traditional partners on those. So really important points. Commodore Leary, could I have some of your comments from a Canadian perspective, how we may be thinking about a new Biden administration and how it's approaching the Indo-Pacific? Sorry, you're on mute, sir.
Now I've got it going. The U.S. has been able to run the Pacific on what was for 40 years on what's called the hub and spoke system, where they were able to almost unilaterally direct the West's response out of Hawaii and Indo-Pacific Command. And I think there's probably a willingness to change that. And certainly in comparison to the Trump administration, brackets, which by the way did a superb job in reversing the Obama's failure to support places like the Philippines over Scarborough Shoal and the like. But the Trump administration, on the other hand, has been accused, probably quite correctly, of running a protection racket with its allies like Korea and Japan. And if you put that in a Canadian context, its conduct abandoning the Kurds, I, as a former policy officer, as a fleet commander, would just dread the idea of the US calling for a multinational operation under the Trump administration and trying to get political support. Gosh, at the same time, they also called Canadian steel a security threat. All of that changes now, but it's a double-edged sword. I think Canada will be far readier to support the US in a multinational naval operation. But I'm also worried that in Canada, we won't be feeling the pressure to back that up with the necessary investments in our military to respond to such a request. That all remains to be seen, and let's all be positive about this.
Thanks so much, Eric. Greg, do you have just some very quick thoughts on this to add on to what you put forward in your initial remarks?
Yeah, I think everybody's nailed it. The biggest impetus under the Biden administration is going to be to approach the Indo-Pacific and the China challenge through a coalition-based effort, and having far more, kind of having the allies already like-minded in a sense on the scale of the China challenge, and having them have spent the last 4 years having to step out in a sense because of the Trump administration, as somebody just put it, their protection racket approach to the alliances, particularly with Korea and Japan, is a helpful starting point. Early on, you'll have efforts by the Biden administration to renegotiate a host nation support agreement with Japan, which was going to be a nightmare under Trump. I imagine they can do better with the Koreans, and I think Eva's right. The biggest change is going to be on the transatlantic relationship, which we don't talk about enough in the context of the Indo-Pacific. But whether it's on the South China Sea or the East China Sea or Taiwan, or certainly trade issues, if China is going to be convinced to change its behavior, it's going to have to be through an international coalition. And that means you have to keep Europe engaged. And the Trump administration made no effort to engage Europe on the Indo-Pacific in any substantive way.
I'll just follow up very quickly on what Greg just said on the transatlantic cooperation. I think there's much to be done actually in the Indo-Pacific, and the transatlantic, communicating, consultation on Indo-Pacific issues within the transatlantic context. As one actor that we never actually mentioned, and is very little mentioned in the Indo-Pacific, is NATO. We see an increasing number of Asian powers, including Australia and Japan, being associated with NATO and having some sort of associated relationship. So I think that that's something, this whole transatlantic dynamic within the Indo-Pacific context is something to be watched, to be worked on and to be watched very closely, because hopefully there are some positive developments there, also on trade issues. I'm not sure if Jonathan is back.
I think we've still lost him. I'd also like to jump in at one more point. The Commodore raised the issue of the Philippines. And I think we don't talk about this enough because in the next few months, one of the first jobs of the Biden administration is going to be that they have to renegotiate the visiting forces agreement with the Philippines. It's still on a clock. In August 18th, I think, the U.S.-Philippines VFA dies, and with it, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and fundamentally the Mutual Defense Treaty, because if the U.S. has to defend Filipino forces from Guam and Okinawa, it can't actually defend Filipino forces. This is a huge problem, and I would caution against historical revisionism about where this problem came from. The Obama administration, to its credit, visited the Philippines a lot, signed and negotiated EDCA, backed the Philippine case before the arbitration award. The Trump administration for 2.5 years didn't even appoint Assistant Secretary for Asia in the State Department. So all of this focus on alliances in the Indo-Pacific has come about in the last 18 months of the administration, largely driven entirely by Mike Pompeo and his anti-China rhetoric. It's been somewhat helpful, but the fact that he stood on a tarmac last year and said we're going to support the Philippines and the South China Sea, it was great, but there's not a lot underneath of that statement, right? The fact that we're still 1,300 miles away in Okinawa doesn't get talked about enough. All people want to do is cheer the fact that we've said that Article 5 applies to the Spratlys, but we don't have any forces anywhere close to the Spratly Islands. So that's the biggest kind of weak read when it comes to our Indo-Pacific strategy that's not getting talked about, and one of the hardest, given that it's the Duterte government. And this is a Democratic administration is going to have to figure out how to deal with a serial human rights abuser / your oldest ally in Asia at one and the same time.
Well, thanks a lot, Greg, and apologies for popping off there. Power outages happen, I guess. And that's why I got someone who wrote a book on the South China Sea to be a moderator, so he could improv in this emergency situation. So yeah, thanks for those comments. The next that we're the moderator discussion to kind of bundle a couple of these next questions, and they segue well into this discussion of coalitions and partnerships and how the U.S. is going to look at dealing much more with a group of like-minded countries to deal with these issues. So the first one is, obviously we'd love to have an Indo-Pacific discussion with everyone here, but we're limited on time. So how about some of the nations that we haven't yet discussed? For example, India, Australia, Vietnam, but also I'm intrigued in your thoughts on South Korea and how it might want to interplay with such a strategy. I think there's been a lot of sentiments that South Korea has been cautious about getting too involved in the Indo-Pacific approaches. Number one, for a fear of inflaming its relationship with China, which is already tenuous, but also perhaps with its tensions with Japan and its feeling that the Indo-Pacific approaches might have a Japanese intellectual background. So that's sort of my first part of the question. And I think dovetailed into that is the discussion of the Quad and the quadrilateral dialogue. And it seems to me, the Quad is finally reborn now, but still a sort of a tepid rebirth. It's working much more quietly, much more in a focused manner. And to me seems sort of as a necessary but not necessarily sufficient answer to a lot of these challenges for, in ways of minilateral and multilateral ways to approach it. So what do you see, number one, how do you kind of see a lot of these other countries working in these frameworks? And number two, how do you see the future of the Quad? Is this something that you feel will grow naturally beyond the Quad, or is that something that should exist in its current formation? And then there are other minilateral groupings that can involve the Europeans, potentially Canada, and others. So maybe I'll actually start with Eva on this, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm a big fan of what I call flexible minilateralism. It's not just, I think everyone has been talking about some sort of flexible multilateralism or flexibility in general. And we see a lot of flexibility in the Indo-Pacific concept, which kind of means that not everyone needs to embrace the terminology of Indo-Pacific to embrace some of the core values that it stands for. I mean, being on the side of a country or a bloc that was really reluctant just to even mention the word for a very long time doesn't mean that we were not promoting the values of it or kind of engaging in the game differently. So I don't think that Korea or some of those other countries will change their mind drastically for all the reasons that you mentioned politically. But the question is whether it's really necessary, because you can continue working with those partners on different levels. And that's why I wanted to bring up some of those non-traditional security issues or functional security issues, because typically Europeans work with Koreans on piracy in the Gulf of Aden, for instance, on crisis prevention, etc., etc. We don't necessarily need to put everyone into the Indo-Pacific basket if they don't want or cannot do so for obvious reasons. And I think that the minilateral solution is and this flexibility is really a way to go, simply. I mean, Quad has been, frankly, off-putting for quite a few countries. Let's say it frankly, France has been solicited since the beginning of the reborn renaissance of Quad, and it's been quite straightforward in saying it will not join, but it is a very close partner, strategic partner with all the 4 members. Bilaterally, it has the most developed strategic ties with Japan, with India and Australia and the United States. And they train bilaterally, trilaterally, quadrilaterally, you name it, multilaterally, Malabar, they're in there. But they just don't want to join the Quad. And I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, we talk about this Quad Plus all the time. I don't think that, it's really just a matter of branding. And Quad has a certain strategic connotation that some countries don't necessarily want to get on board with, and it's perfectly fine to work kind of loosely with anyone that shares the same concerns on ad hoc issues. Fine.
Yeah, thanks. That's great comments, Eva. And I would agree. I mean, I think one of the things that my thought of the Quad 1.0, and even as it's kind of developing again, is it should focus much less on the sort of the atmospherics. So basically, getting the ministers together, getting the big, the photos and the press statements, and much more at the tangible level, at the working level. So again, as some would say, at the boring level, but that is the boring levels where things actually matter and things actually happen. So whether this is at the director general level or assistant secretary level, having those dialogues where you can work on issues such as capacity building, et cetera. I think that is much more impactful than sending necessarily political statements exclusively at the ministerial level. Okay, can I move to Ken to have your thoughts on others outside of the Quad and also the Quad, how you kind of see these different frameworks working in the next coming months?
Yeah, thank you. I basically agree with the many of the aspects that Eva laid out, that something that you are seeing today is the evolution of the flexible sets of multilateralism, and including Quad. And there has been a significant development of the functional cooperation among the Quad members, and having naval exercises, and also more like a periodical sharing of the information among the joint chiefs and defense ministers. And those are the significant development that we have had so far. But when you talk about some, like a U.S. senior official mentioned about the future potential of having Asia version of NATO type of institutionalization, I think we are way behind from that kind of perspective of having institutionalization based on Indo-Pacific cooperation. And I think that the Indo-Pacific cooperation can be best performed with more like non-official, flexible cooperation based on the common interests, rather than pursuing the rigid rule-based institutionalism. So I think that is the basic, a characterization of what we had on the Indo-Pacific cooperation. And I would like to mention a few about South Korea, and I think Jonathan is best qualified to talk about the role played by South Korea. But I think that Korea, the basic kind of priority that they have is obviously that in the Korean Peninsula, North-South relationships still play a predominant role in their policy priorities, but they are seeming to expand that regional engagement view through a number of initiatives, including their new southbound diplomacy, and also their, the policy engagement in the economic cooperation schemes, including their intention to be part of the TPP negotiations in recent manner, and also they also be part of the including the maritime security aspects as well, by engaging many of those defense industries in Southeast Asia, and also joining some of those unilateral cooperation between them, so that there will be a high potential that even having a kind of low profile Japan-Korea relationship that really has been a stumbling block to have a so-called virtual cooperation among the U.S.-Japan-Korea relationship. But by expanding the viewpoint of the regional engagement, there will be, I think, high potential that the Korea also could be a part of the larger cooperation framework as well.
Thanks a lot, Jimbo-san. I think that's some really good points. And I think on Korea, and maybe I'll go to Greg next on this, but I think he alluded to this as well, that I think one of the big priorities for the upcoming U.S. administration, I think, will be to sort of mend some of the wounds in that alliance relationship. And that may provide an opening for the U.S. to kind of work together much more closely with South Korea on its Indo-Pacific approach. So it may provide an opening for South Korea to work more with countries such as Japan, despite those tensions. So Greg, what's your kind of thoughts on this? Again, you spend much of the year usually pre-pandemic in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. How are different countries in that region looking at the Quad? Obviously, there seems to be some suspicion of it, but what are some of the frameworks going forward? Do you think that there's other ways outside the Quad? Is a Quad Plus possible? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that we have to get comfortable with kind of messy multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific these days. The idea that there is a singular answer and that we're somehow aiming toward it, and if we can bring all of these strings together, we'll have it. That's a fantasy, I think. And the Quad is a pretty good example of that, right? The Quad is at the moment a very useful high-level diplomatic venue. I think it's going to be increasingly useful in coordinating maritime security, among other issues, in the Indo-Pacific or in the Indian Ocean. The idea that we're going to operationalize the Quad for some real-world effects to the east of the Malacca Strait seems like a fantasy to me. And Delhi's pretty painfully clear that they have little interest in doing that. The rest of us just need to listen. If we look at, what are we going to see from Korea, you see much the same. Korea is going to be very useful on a lot of issues, but, South China Sea is not going to be one of them, for instance. I mean, they'll speak up diplomatically softly, but they're not going to be doing any operational assertions. And in Southeast Asia, one of the things we have to accept is that there has to be a two-track approach to engagement with our Southeast Asian partners. ASEAN is an important, smart bet for the long-term security of the region. If you're looking for a way to build regional architecture, that's the only possible core. There's just not enough strategic trust in Northeast Asia to do it. And India doesn't have any interest. So invest in ASEAN, but don't think ASEAN is your answer to everything. And the South China Sea is a good example. The U.S. should not think, and neither should any other partner, that ASEAN is going to solve South China Sea issues. No, you do that bilaterally by engaging the Philippines, Vietnam, and maybe Singapore. And everybody else is academic to that discussion. One of the things that's painfully clear increasingly is Vietnam's frustration with ASEAN itself. We did a survey of strategic elites across the region earlier this year, and one of the questions was, what's your preferred venue for regional security architecture? And every ASEAN country overwhelmingly said ASEAN, except for Vietnam, which said the Quad. Vietnam's not even part of a Quad, but Vietnamese elites are so disillusioned with ASEAN that they would rather invest their faith in India helping solve problems in the South China Sea. So that's kind of my messy way of saying we need to get comfortable with the idea that we're going to have to engage in a whole lot of venues, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral, that generally point in the same direction, but they're not all going to be equally useful on singular issues. And one of the ways to frame this, perhaps, as Macdonald-Laurier suggested, is that it's an evolution, for the US at least, from our old idea of a hub and spokes. Now we have multiple hubs. Some of them don't even involve the United States, and that's fine. They are all generally pointed toward trying to get Beijing to rise within the system rather than without it. And so, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and that's fine.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and of the hub and spokes and the ones that are not even U.S. centric now. And I think one of the benefits is, I think Eva mentioned that 4 years will pass and the U.S. will have to sort of adjust to some of the changes that have been happening. And some of them are in their favor. I mean, if you think, for example, of the Australia-Japan relationship and how strong that relationship has, obviously there is a trilateral mechanism to work with the U.S. but there's also a trilateral mechanism to work with India that does not include the U.S. So I think there's a lot of overlapping mini-laterals there that can work in U.S. favor. So I think I did have one extra question, but I think I'm going to push that and go straight to the audience questions, because this is a question that also the audience is very interested in. So I think that we'll cover that in the audience portion. And the audience has a range of interesting questions that they put forward. And I think I'll put forward the first one, which kind of looks very closely at the one that I was interested in. And this is focused on Canada and its role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think it's really focused on, so is some of this tilt, or is Canada's sort of role in the Indo-Pacific sustainable from a resource perspective? Is this something that, not only from a resource perspective, I know this is something Commodore-Laurier would be very interested in looking at, but is this something that Canada can really see itself sustaining as a policy, as being an active member in the Indo-Pacific? Is this something that we can do more than just pay lip service to? So maybe I'll start with Commodore-Laurier and then go around.
Thank you very much, and very important to look at the resources. The people in Canada suggest joining the Quad, and I think for all the reasons that have just been discussed, it's not ready for us, and we're not ready for it. Given our weakness of our China policy, why would you want us? And two, our resources are limited, and for the longest time, we have sought access to the ASEAN subgroups of the East Asia Summit and the Association of Defense Ministers Plus, and we've been told quite bluntly, your presence in the region does not support your call for membership. So what can be done about that? Well, I'm not waiting for us to reach 2% defense spending. But certainly there are small things we can do. We have an ambassador to ASEAN in Indonesia. I'll bet he has no staff at all dedicated to this. He certainly does not have something like our NATO cell, where he'd be supported by a 3-star admiral or general who could go to all these meetings, because we're not even attending the meetings now. Second, within our current resources, we can do a far better job of rebalancing things towards the Pacific. And this has been called for, and it's about time we start to make sure that the West Coast Fleet has the same resources as the Atlantic Fleet. I think we can also look at a range of options where we can contribute. Looking at maritime surveillance. There's been an attempt, I understand, for ASEAN to set up a maritime cell. And most of the countries probably suffer from a lack of inability to see what precisely is going on with their region. Well, Canada should be helping out with staff and money in that regard. We should certainly support any call for the Americans who are already doing a great functional multilateralism with the U.S. Navy, be it from the Organization of Freedom of Navigation Supports to RIMPAC. Well, I think the next step may well be the First Fleet initiative, if that takes wind. And I think that's about all I'll say, and leave it to the rest.
Okay, that's perfect. Thanks, Eric. So for others, you don't have to spend long on this. I know some of you may not be Canadian defense or naval experts, but from an outside perspective, how do you see, Canada in the Indo-Pacific? Do you see this as something, when you're thinking of the different countries that should be involved in these coalitions? What's your sort of elevator pitch, or your sort of 30-second thought on Canada in this region? So maybe if I'll start with Ken, and then I'll go to Greg and Eva.
Well, thank you very much. I think Canada has been a long-standing Asia-Pacific power, especially since 1980s, involving a lot of a multilateral economic cooperation. And Canada is part of the TPP, and that also brings in the very important standard setter for the high quality trade and investment regional order. So Canada is, entirely qualified to become, the Indo-Pacific state in that regard. And secondly, several already mentioned that the Canada has also been part of the lots of joining in the exercises and being part of those presence operation that will bring in the collective pressure to be sent out, especially to Beijing, what kind of the maritime order and the safety measures to be implemented by having a Canadian participation. That is also important. And in third, there will be a lot of demands for the capacity building, especially for the maritime security in the coastal area in ASEAN and also South Asia. On those parts, I think Canadian expertise and also the capacity and resources can also be a part of huge, I think, value-added aspects. And in those, I think there will be a lot of potential that the Canada can explore, even though the resource is said to be limited. But I think that there will be a lot of potential that Canada will increase the presence in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And I think it's an important point. While from the defense side and the naval side, obviously there are resource constraints. I think that when we're looking at, even from a security perspective, an Indo-Pacific security approach that encompasses maritime issues, it need not be focused all on what the Navy can do. I think there's a really large element to that, even from the diplomacy side, that really is not so intensive on costs and resources that would have a big impact. And I use one example of when China declared its air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. I believe that was in 2013. And when that declaration happened, our declaration, or our sort of statement after that, was very, very late. I think it was some 6 or 8 weeks late. And things like that, those are not necessarily resource issues. I mean, it's not that it requires a multitude of resources to get those statements out quickly, but those sort of things show a clarity of purpose of how we're looking and how we're thinking about our partners and allies in that region. So those things, I think, can be done on the cheap and just need to be focused much more closely. So thank you for those comments. Greg, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I'd say that Canada is as important a middle power as any other, except perhaps Australia and Japan in this context. And Australia and Japan have the benefit of geography, right? Canada does as much diplomatically and largely operationally as any of the European powers. And if we are, and now that's not spread evenly across all domains, of course. I'd argue the French do more on naval instance, for instance, but France has never called for China to comply with the South China Sea Award. Canada did the day it was issued. The UK did, but it took them 2 years. So, there's a lot of issues on which we could complain about Canadian policy, but there's also a lot of issues on which Canada deserves laurels. And, Canada's a member of Five Eyes, on and on. If the goal is to incentivize Beijing to change its behavior on a number of fronts, then Canada has to be part of that coalition, because it has to be a global effort. It cannot be the US, Australia, and Japan alone, which is what it has often been painted as on a number of these issues. And Canada, look, the Michaels are about to spend another Christmas in detention precisely because Canada refuses to buckle to Chinese pressure. Canada deserves kudos for that. So I'll save my slings and arrows for my own administration and not cast them at Ottawa.
Thanks so much, and thanks again for mentioning the Michaels. We're just this week is the 2-year anniversary of that, and I think a lot of us who've been able to engage with Michael Kovrig at different conferences continue to think about him and his family at this time. So it's as you said, we are kind of caught in the crossfire of this. So it's thank you for mentioning that. Eva, did you have any sort of thoughts on this point on Canada and the Indo-Pacific?
Actually do, just quickly, because when we say resources, I think I might be in a minority when thinking on other things than just military and naval, to be honest. And it was said here, it's the diplomatic engagement, it's the financial engagement, but it's also the intellectual input that you see in Canada's contribution in a lot of the multilateral discussions that we see in the region. Every time we speak about the Canadian involvement in Asia security, I can't help but think of my PhD research, which was on provisional measures to territorial disputes, to settling territorial disputes in East Asia. And some of my case studies were the Gulf of Thailand initiative and the workshops on the South China Sea in the 90s run by Pakashim Jalal. Both of those initiatives were actually financed by and initiated by Canada. And we don't often remind ourselves of this. I had huge respect for those initiatives. Then they were, frankly, if you study the South China Sea long enough, some of the biggest breakthroughs and the first series that run for 9 years at that time, that really made some progress and chartered some of the new approaches to those issues. So it's really not necessarily about the gunboats on the ground. It's really just, it's sometimes about innovative solutions. And I find Canada, same as sometimes Europeans or New Zealand, are part of those countries that really can contribute to regional security through those means.
Well, thanks, and thanks for kind of going back and reaching into that history, because I think that's something a lot of the Canadian intellectuals do kind of hold as a pin of pride, but nobody really notices that or knows that, or very few do. So we're really happy that you kind of reference that, and I think it's important too to not, to give ourselves a little bit of credit too. I think on the intellectual side, there is a role that we can play too. Canada hasn't necessarily been the most active recently, unfortunately, in CSCAP, for example, but that's a forum that traditionally we were very active at from the beginning, and we hope to get more and more engaged and active in bodies like that, and also sort of one-off summitry processes such as the Shangri-La Dialogue. I think is a real role for a lot of us and public intellectuals and academics at these events too. So it's more than just, as I said, the Navy or just even the diplomatic side. I think this is something that that those outside of government can also play a role in. So we're running a little bit low on time, so I'd like to just see if I can fit two quick questions in, and then I think we'll finish up. The first one, and I think this is a really interesting one. It's been touched on very briefly by a few of the panelists, but we haven't really had a chance to kind of get into it too much. Scott, one of our viewers, is asking, what's the best role for Taiwan in helping us meet the security challenges of the Indo-Pacific? And what sort of role could Canada potentially play in that as well? So, what do you think about Taiwan and the different Indo-Pacific approaches? Obviously, it's an extremely sensitive issue for China. But as we've seen in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, that's been improving quite a bit significantly over the last 4 years. And I think other countries have been improving their relations with Taiwan too, maybe less publicly. But what's the viewpoint? Maybe I'll start with Greg on this. How do we look at Taiwan in the coming months and how it fits into this sort of Indo-Pacific rubric?
Thanks, Jonathan. This is another one of those issues where I think Washington has shifted and continues to shift. So it is now, again, this largely is a result of Hong Kong, the sense that Hong Kong was the final nail in the idea of peaceful reunification. And not just for Washington, but for Taipei too, right? And any hope within Taiwan that that was a viable future is now gone. And so if the long-term prognosis is that there is no hope for peaceful reunification, then there needs to be a shift in our policy toward doing all that is necessary to support Taiwan's autonomy. And a lot of initiatives that would have been inconceivable just a couple of years ago now in Washington are absolutely mainstream. I mean, we talked about arms sales. There's a very active debate now about whether or not there should be a free trade agreement or something approaching a free trade agreement between the U.S. and Taiwan. Those discussions aren't limited to the U.S. I think you're hearing similar discussions in Australia, in Japan, in Europe. Everybody recognizes that the space for Taiwan is shrinking, and while we can't, it's too dangerous and provocative to really try to widen that aperture too much vis-a-vis Beijing. We do have to prevent further shrinking of Taiwan's international space. I don't know what else to say. There are no good answers here, but this is going to be one of those issues where the international community just has to draw a line in the sand and say here, no further.
Thanks, Greg. Commodore Leary, could I have your thoughts on this, on Taiwan and its role in these frameworks?
Certainly. A Canadian role is to support the entry of Taiwan into the CPP, and perhaps even assisted by the US eventually signing on to it. We can also, Taiwan has done great work for itself, and it's done great work for the rest of us in setting a superb example with its COVID response. And there are other areas where it's an expert. It's an expert in cyber defense. It's been expert in intelligence work, especially with regard to China. And I'm told, and I believe it, that Canada is not taking any advantage of the offers Taiwan has made in those areas to contribute to our own security. And then when you look at Canada and seeking greater involvement, greater understanding in the region, where's our Chinese speakers? Well, I dare say you don't want to send them to Beijing to be taught. We should be taking up or creating an opportunity with Taiwan for language speaking for diplomats and security officials. Thanks again.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I think Taiwan traditionally has been a really important relationship for Canada, but I think that you've underscored that we really need to find a way to strategize this relationship in a much more precise way and sort of an unapologetic way too. I think there's many areas that we can work with Taiwan on, Trans-Pacific Partnership being one. But it's a lot of important insights that you put there. Ken, can you give us a little insights on how Japan views Taiwan and how Japan may view Taiwan sort of inclusion in some of this architecture? Obviously a very sensitive point for Japan and its relationships with China as well. But my understanding is that the relationship between Japan and Taiwan has been incrementally warming. It was always a relatively warm relationship in recent years, but it's been warming year by year. How do you see this?
Well, obviously, Taiwan is a geostrategically very important actor for Japan, and our cultural ties has been quite strong. And I think that those relationship will be recognized continuously for incoming months and years. But something that we have with an increasing concern, as Greg mentioned, that their political security space is very much being squeezed by the rise of Chinese power and the changing concept of the air and naval superiority in the Taiwan Straits. And there is a very hard to maintain the status quo by putting the proportional kind of capability that the Taiwan can deal with the Chinese ever heightening kind of offensive posture vis-a-vis Taiwan. So whether we could have kind of encouraging kind of efforts to have more like a resilient posture of Taiwan vis-a-vis Chinese offense will be, I think, highly important nature. And that's what I think the Trump administration tried to do, especially in the recent months. But whether Japan could be part of those kind of, coordination to tacitly encouraging their capacity is still, it's a very kind of touchy subject, as you mentioned, because it is also be under the structure of the wider Japan, Beijing, Tokyo-Beijing relationship, which has also been improving in recent 2 years. So that economic interest is still there, and that has been very much overwhelmed by the potential kind of growth of the Chinese market, and the Japanese business sectors and automobile company manufacturers are still very much attracted by the potential rise of China. Whether we could invest strategically on Taiwan at the expense of losing such kind of opportunity in China is still doubtful. So that there is a very much nuanced way of engaging Taiwan from Tokyo's perspective.
Thanks, Jimbo-san. That's really helpful, and I think as you said, Taiwan is quite a tightrope. I think sometimes for Japan to walk, but an important tightrope nonetheless. It seems whenever Sino-Japanese relations are improving, this seems to be one of the sort of vulnerability points that the Chinese always like to push on, and I think are very much wanting to weaken that element of Japan-Taiwan ties at any opportunity they get. Eva, you have the final word on this. So what's your, from a European perspective, on how Taiwan should be involved in some of these frameworks?
Well, I would definitely not speak about the official EU or European perspective in this sense, if I'm allowed. But clearly, the Taiwan issue is really this thing that hangs there that we just tend to avoid. Is too sensitive. We don't even coordinate properly internationally on the issue. We don't actually address it in a very serious way. And as Greg said, it is really the last red line that we need to be thinking of. And it clearly is the strategically indispensable partner in the region if we manage to engage properly internationally with Taiwan. But I'm a little bit optimistic actually when everyone says it's just this untouchable problem and we can't even discuss it. I happen to come from a very, very small Central European country that happened to make headlines just a couple of months ago with our Senate Speaker's visit to Taipei and his famous quote, "I am Taiwanese," which eventually kind of took the whole world by surprise. And what was even more kind of warming, I found, was the reaction from the international community and the support that eventually he received, including from European leaders, which was afterwards actually triggered by the harsh reaction by Beijing and criticism of Beijing, and then eventually we criticized the reaction itself. We were actually told to behave, and the European leaders issued a joint response saying that diplomats, that this is not a diplomatic language that should be used between equal partners. And eventually the whole affair escalated to an open letter suggesting Europe may be rethinking its one China policy. I mean, this is a little bit far-fetched, but I'm just trying to say that even a small country and a small gesture like this can eventually trigger a reaction that may have an impact, and that we should not necessarily be constantly just hiding behind the sensitivity of the topic.
Thanks so much, Eva. And I think that's a great way for us to end. I think today we've had a good range of comments and discussions and questions from the audience on a range of different issues. I think we talked quite a bit of the maritime security issues ranging from East China Sea, South China Sea to the Taiwan Straits. And I think we also got into, which is important, is the broader strategic framework that we're talking about here. So we could have spent the entire 90 minutes focused on freedom of navigation operations and intricate maritime security issues, but we did look at the broader strategic framing which is happening. And I think the timing is really important with the new U.S. administration coming in. So again, I thank everyone for joining us from all the different capitals that you've joined. Again, Ken, I think it's time for you to get some sleep. Very late there in Japan. But thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to having a chance to gathering everyone again in person, hopefully sometime this year. I'm optimistic that 2021 will be a better year. I guess it's next year, 2021. But thank you so much to everyone, and thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Thank you, everybody.